we're going to be looking at how looking at different lives parallel to each other can bring out different research points today, and particularly thinking about disability and about queer lives and what researching them might entail. So I'm going to introduce you to our panel. So we have today Annika Lukbovitz, who is a writer, researcher, and editor based in Munster, Germany, whose work focuses on landscape, space, and the politics of walking. She's the editor of an anthology on psychogeography, which is psychogeography. I don't speak German, so I'm going to really garble Annika's German titles here, forgive me, and has published several essays about urban walking in Berlin. Annika holds a PhD in English Literatures from Humboldt University, Berlin, and is the author of the study Haunted Spaces in 21st Century British Nature Writing. In August 2025, she published her non-fiction book Rebellinnen zu Fuß, auf den Spuren von 11 literarischen Wanderinnen, which is Rebels by Foot. I'm watching Annie laugh at me now, with portraits of walking women writers from the Enlightenment to the 21st century. And you can find her online on Instagram as @MallardThought. A writer, translator, and cultural project leader, Annie Rutherford makes things with words and champions poetry and translated literature in all its guises. Her published translations include full collections by poets Nora Gombringer and Vola Hapayeya, as well as Isabel Bodkin's novel The Peacock and Annette von Droste-Hülshoff's novella The Jew's Beach. Annie was a 2025 translator in residence for the British Centre for Literary Translation and has previously been a mentor on the National Centre for Writing's Emerging Translator Mentorships. She currently works as creative producer at Push the Boat Out, Edinburgh's International Poetry Festival. Abby Palmer is a first-year PhD candidate at the University of Cumbria. Their main research focus is on how an individual's identity affects their navigation of spaces and places. Abby's PhD thesis is titled I Feel Neither Man Nor Woman in Society, Space, Place and Queer Identity in the Writing of Anne Lister. Previously, they studied an MA in Literature, Romanticism and the English Lake District at the University of Cumbria, and their thesis analysed spaces and places in the writing of Cumbrian poet Norman Nicholson. For their BA Literature dissertation at Sheffield Hallam, they wrote on the use of corridors in Gothic fiction. Abby is a committee member of the Norman Nicholson Society and a teaching associate at the University of Cumbria, and also works part-time as a bookseller at the wonderful Sam Reed bookseller in Grasmere, and they're currently working on their first poetry pamphlet. I'm Polly Atkin, and I'm a poet and non-fiction writer. My work focuses on nature, place and disability. My third poetry collection, Emergency Dream, is coming out with Seren in March. My non-fiction includes Recovering Dorothy, The Hidden Life of Dorothy Wordsworth, which was the first biography of Dorothy Wordsworth's later life and illness, and was longlisted for the Barbellion Prize in 2022. My third non-fiction book, most recently, is The Company of Owls, and both that and Some of Us Is Fall were longlisted for the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing. I've got a PhD from Lancaster University and taught English and creative writing at QMUL, Lancaster, and the Universities of Strathclyde and Cumbria before defecting, and I now own the historic Grasmere bookshop, Sam Reed Bookseller. So welcome, everybody, to this panel, which I hope will be interesting in lots of different ways. It's a little bit fun, a little bit creative, and raises lots of different questions as we go on. So over to Annie to begin.
Thank you so much, Polly. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for having us. I'm going to start with a little introduction. The slideshow has versions of the project and images from the project we've been working on. So just a bit of an explanation of the black backgrounds and the audio that you will be seeing there will hopefully give you a sense of what we're talking about. So yeah, Query Points is a choose your own adventure literary excursion interweaving texts by the English poet and diarist Dorothy Wordsworth and the German author and composer Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, with new work by myself, Polly, and Annika. Through our responses to their texts and through the juxtaposition of Dorothy and Droste's work with both their own writing and each other's, we sought to explore, and above all, to let the reader explore, disability and queerness in their lives and work, as well as to point to the existence of a lineage of arguably queer and crit female writers by writing back to them. The project exists in both English and German and can be experienced as a digital and audio version or in print. The title of the piece, Query Points, is drawn from Dorothy Wordsworth's Alfoxden journals and the notes Dorothy often made to herself when writing about her walks. Query, are the male and female flowers on separate trees, for instance? Notably, she never came back to answer these queries to herself. Her questions remain open, and we wanted Query Points to act as that initial spark of active inquiry and engagement without itself presenting hard and fast answers. In this collaborative talk, we'll begin by briefly introducing our project's two protagonists, Dorothy Wordsworth and Annette von Droste-Hülshoff. We'll then look at the queer possibilities in their lives and writing, which are often overlooked, before discussing the creative ways they found of dealing with illness through their writing and imaginative travel. We'll then recapitulate how these insights on Dorothy and Droste's lives and works influenced the conception of the audio work before sharing some of the historical and contemporary texts and the prompts drawn from them. And we'll end by considering how creative responses to texts can open new channels of inquiry and understanding before then passing on to Abby to hear more about the project. So Polly, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. So Dorothy Wordsworth was born in Cockermouth on the northwest fringes of the English Lake District on Christmas Day, 1771. She's best known as the sister of the poet William Wordsworth, of course, and is one of the most widely read life writers in the English language, with her Alfoxden and Grasmere journals, kept from 1798 to 1803, recording her life as part of a creative collaborative household, as well as her life as a woman who walked, climbed, and wrote about it. Poetry enthusiasts, scholars, walkers, and nature lovers have pored over her words since they were first extracted by her nephew in his Memoir of William in 1851. Through her early biographers, she became cemented as less an independent being than half of the poet Wordsworth, as a comrade in work, walking, and writing, employing both her extraordinary physical strength and her mental gifts in making William's poetry live.
Annette von Droste-Hülshoff was born in January 1797 at Burg Hülshoff near Münster in Westphalia in Germany. Droste, too, is famous for her descriptions of landscape and rural life in her home region, in her case, the heathlands of Westphalia, and in the later part of her life, the alpine surroundings of Lake Constance, where she lived with her sister and her brother-in-law. Droste is one of the very few women writers who made it into the canon of German literature, but she is hardly known outside of the German-speaking world. Her eerie ballad, The Boy in the Moor, about a walk in the moor which almost ends deadly, is one of the most famous poems in the German language and common school reading. While the popular image of Droste links her with the conservatism of the Biedermeier era, tame nature poetry, and just as tamely braided hair, more recent scholarship has come to revise this image quite thoroughly, drawing on the critical edition of Droste's work and letters by Winfried Wörsler. Droste is now being rediscovered as a pioneer in ecological writing, as well as a proto-feminist who queered conceptions of love and gender in her writing, and as a surprisingly modern mind whose poetic innovation silently revolutionized German literature on its way from romanticism to literary realism. I hand over to Annie.
I first came to know Annette von Droste-Hülshoff as a translator. I've been part of several projects at Burg Hülshoff Center for Literature, bringing translators together to translate Droste's work. And these collaborative translations, collaborative workshops made me very aware of how our own perspectives inform our understandings of the text and of the limitations we ascribe to the lives of historical figures. In one workshop, we were translating Wo bist du noch, O Mädchen, or in English, Oh tell me girl, where are you? And one of my colleagues said, well, the narrator has to be a man in the poem, because otherwise it would be lesbian. To which I replied, yes. But while I had been long aware of the queer possibilities in Droste's poetry, it wasn't until I developed chronic fatigue that I realized with a jolt that I'd been completely ignoring another part of Droste's biography, that of living with illness. By putting Droste in conversation with Dorothy Wordsworth, a woman writer of around the same time who also lived with illness and had similarly intense and intimate female friendships, we wanted to illuminate these aspects of their lives and to develop a lineage of crip and queer writers, a lineage which would in turn play into contemporary conversations around disability and queerness. A note on the difficulty of talking about illness and disability and queerness with regards to historical figures, as Polly has written in the forthcoming Cambridge edition on Dorothy Wordsworth in Context, edited by Jessica Fay, retrospective diagnosis is both unethical and necessarily flawed. As Axel Karenberg wrote in 2009, retrospective diagnosis strongly violates the principles of the medical profession, basing speculation on a patient, the diagnostician. I did practice this one, I promise, but we're going to move on. Has never seen nor examined. The long dead patient cannot give consent, and as Osamu Muramoto notes, it is impossible to have adequate access to the historical reality. Polly goes on to say of Dorothy that there is benefit to retrospective diagnosis, however, as A.G. Lana argues, to better understand an individual's life and work and to correct or amend previous interpretations. Both of these are important reasons for reconsidering evidence around Dorothy's illness, and the latter makes it imperative. It is possible to work with ethics and elasticity, avoiding definitive diagnoses while attempting to undo the harm caused by generations of scholarly speculation into Dorothy's health that has perpetuated inaccurate, damaging, and often improbable claims. Sorry, moving between pieces of paper. A very similar set of caveats can be made when talking about queerness in a historical context, and are equally difficult to navigate. As Finn Longman states in No Platonic Explanations, warnings not to apply anachronistic labels can become a denial of queer pasts. The truthful statement that an individual wouldn't have understood themselves as homosexual because the concept of identity formed around sexual attraction is still a few hundred years off is taken as denying the possibility that the individual's feelings and behaviours may have been more or less indistinguishable from those of somebody who would understand themselves as gay now. Longman goes on to counter, though, that there genuinely is ambiguity in many of these relationships, both in terms of the behaviours they might have involved and in the labels that might accurately be applied to them. Even when we have reasonably accurate records of behaviours, we might not have records of feelings that would tell us what those behaviours meant to those people. And when we're dealing with quite a different taxonomy of relationships, identities, and emotions, that is an issue. And often, as Longman says, approaches which insist on reading historical figures as gay erase other queer possibilities. All of which is to say that we can't and shouldn't identify Droste or Dorothy as gay or bi or aromantic, just as we can't diagnose the illnesses they experienced. What we can say, though, is that both of these women prioritized and celebrated relationships that did not conform to heteronormative models, instead centering alternative, let's say queer, relationships that did not, and forms of kinship and love. In Recovering Dorothy, Polly admits, this book is full of things I don't know. It is not an attempt to diagnose Dorothy, but to recognize her. It is an attempt to recenter Dorothy in her own life. Query Points is an attempt to continue that recentering for both Dorothy and Droste. And Anna, I'm going to pass back to you.
What we know for sure about Droste, for example, is that she had close relationships with other intellectual women, such as Katharina Schücking, Elise Rüdiger, Amalie Hassenpflug, Sibylle Mertens-Schafhausen, and Adele Schopenhauer. They were relationships which, on a linguistic level at least, had very clear erotic components and which were equal in her eyes to heterosexual marriage. For instance, in a letter to Sibylle Mertens-Schafhausen, whose love affairs to other women were an open secret in her circle of friends, Droste wrote, half joking, half serious, "In 7 years, we will be able to celebrate our silver wedding anniversary." Many more of these private letters, however, were intentionally burned. And then there's the whole lot of Droste's sensual and strange nature poetry to think of when it comes to queerness. There's, for example, her poem Meine Sträuße, or My Posies, and you can see an extract from it on the slide. In this, the speaker describes dried flowers hung in her bedchamber, which remind her of shared moments with female friends/lovers in nature, an oddly eco-erotic undertone going beyond the familiar symbolism of flower plucking is present in it as well. So if there's this line, "Our gushing emotions were muddled, a flood," which is, the translation is by Annie, by the way. Sorry for not mentioning it earlier. Very important information. And the poem ends in a climax with the words, "A sigh of love comes from the rose, and like by veins I am embraced by my waterweeds and moss." In a new queer reading of Droste, referring to her edits of her own manuscripts, the German author Angela Steidele, who unfortunately couldn't join our panel tonight, highlights how gender fluid Droste's poetry is and how little her texts have to do with the image of the Catholic aristocratic Fräulein chastely sitting in the tower writing ghost stories and nature poems. Droste doesn't merely sexualize nature, as Steidele demonstrates with reference to Droste's poem The Needle in the Tree, which is yet another poem about past love. She shows nothing less than that women can love men and women and everything in between. Even if Droste wanted to share as little as possible of her personal life with her contemporary public and their expectations, she left to posterity texts filled with illusions. Texts which, with their waywardness, their ambivalence, and their irony, seem like secret messages which only accomplices can decode.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that idea of secret messages later on as we hear from Abby as well. It's easier to detail what we don't know about Dorothy's intimate and romantic life than what we do. There's no first-hand record of her having any intention of marrying or of holding any particular desire to, nor of any attachments to any particular men. The closest we have in her own words is an adamant denial of any romantic aspirations towards William Wilberforce in a letter to her friend Jane Pollard written in April 1790. Wilberforce had been staying with Dorothy's uncle's family when 19-year-old Dorothy is living at the time. In January, she'd written to Jane that she considered Wilberforce the best of men and explained how he had given her some money to use for good causes as she chose. Her next letter to Jane attempts to correct the assumption clearly made in Jane's reply that there's a romantic attachment between them. Dorothy, much diverted by the idea, as she says, assures Jane, "No man I have seen has appeared to regard me with any degree of partiality, nor has any one gained my affections. Of this you need not doubt." Much later, Dorothy's niece Dora would teasingly call her middle-aged spinster aunt, Dorothy, and her avowed bachelor friend, Henry Crabb Robinson, the lovers. But this public jest, if anything, acts as proof of nothing romantic in that close and important friendship. Dorothy never expresses a wish to become a wife or mother, and the ideal home she imagines for herself is with Jane Pollard and her brother William, not with a husband and children. Indeed, the only relationship of Dorothy's that seems to fit a romantic paradigm is that with her dearest girl, Jane Pollard. Is what she calls her in 1787. Dorothy's teenage love letters to Jane, teenage letters to Jane, which really are love letters, detail her ardent longing and an aching heart for Jane, have increasingly been read as queer, including by poet Romy Smith. In January 1788, Dorothy writes to Jane, who she has not seen for over a year, "Oh, Jane, how dearly do I love you! No words can paint my affection and friendship for you, my dear girl. When shall we meet? Sometimes I am in despair and think that happy time will never arrive. At others, I am all hope." And that's just a fraction of that kind of language in her letters to Jane. She sent Jane a lock of her hair and a thimble. Jane has sent her a handkerchief, which Dorothy keeps on her at all times, and Dorothy asks for a lock of Jane's hair. Dorothy worries in letters that Jane no longer loves her as she did, or that Dorothy has let Jane down in some unidentified way, or not demonstrated her love adequately. Whilst clearly suggestive of deep affection, none of this may seem out with the bounds of intense teenage female friendship, if it were not that Dorothy does not express such strong feelings about anyone else in her writing in the whole rest of her life. The reality of those feelings simply cannot be known to us, however we may speculate. Some read her friendships as just that, intense friendships. The 2021 zine Our Friend Dorothy explores Dorothy's friendships as reflective of Arrow Ace experiences. Others see irrepressible romantic feeling in them. Dorothy is very careful about what she commits to paper as she gets older. She deliberately leaves gaps in her journal, for example, around meetings with her brother's French former partner Annette Vallon and William's illegitimate daughter Caroline, both in 1802 and 1820. We cannot know what else she simply does not write down. And over to Annie.
For examples of poems by Droste and Dorothy which open up queer possibilities, you might want to read Droste's Meine Sträuße, which Annika quoted from and is translated in the game as My Bouquet, or Dorothy's Irregular Verses, both of which celebrate the writer's relationships with women and are included in Query Points. And the project teases out these queer possibilities by putting the text, as well as Dorothy's letters to Jane, in conversation with each other through a poetic response by myself.
So Dorothy had episodes of debilitating illness throughout her life, and in her late 50s she became seriously ill. From 1829 to 1835 she has a succession of acute episodes of illness during which it's thought she might die. Each leaves her with mobility impairments and ongoing symptoms. The last acute episode in 1835 leaves her with a cognitive impairment and housebound for the following 20 years. Her story is one of disability history, which, like many such histories, has been hidden or ignored. In Disability Studies and the Environmental Humanities Towards an Eco-Crip Theory, Sarah Jacquette Ray characterises what she calls the wilderness body ideal, underpinning thinking and writing about nature and the outdoors. Abled, male, white, in many ways analogous to Kathleen Jamie's lone enraptured male. Dorothy has so often been held up as emblematic of a kind of feminized version of the wilderness body ideal, a woman who strode out and wrote about it at a time when it was unusual to do so. But the attachment of scholars to the wilderness body ideal has stopped them from recognizing her as part of disability history, and disability as central to her writing. Dorothy's experience of illness began long before 1829. Her journals and letters trace how her long walks are interspersed since her teens, with days in bed and headaches and stomach aches and sudden dizziness and fatigue. We actually have no writing of hers that comes from a time before she experienced some kind of chronic illness. Disability poetics has always been concerned with anomalous ways of encountering the world, as Jim Ferris puts it. I'd argue for Dorothy Wordsworth as a foundational writer in disability eco-poetics, a poetics which, as Sam Walton writes, crosses imaginative boundaries and challenges humanity's supposed separateness from the natural world and from other bodies, sharing stylistic ground and techniques with experimental poetry and queer ecopoetics. Annika.
Like Dorothy, thanks. Droste too was a keen and persistent walker. And like her, she was far away from aligning to the wilderness body ideal. On good days, Droste described herself as a fast walker, effortlessly walking the 9 miles back and forth between her home at Rüschhaus and the city of Münster. At the same time, her letters reveal how often she was unable to walk or do anything at all due to illness. In 1829, she wrote to her practitioner, Clemens von Bönninghausen, one of the first homeopathic doctors in Germany, and listed 53 symptoms of an unnamed illness or several illnesses, including headache, and that's quoted from the letter, headache mostly at the back of my head, mild in the mornings, stronger at midday, often very strong in the evenings, rumbling in my abdomen, pain in my left chest, and great melancholy. Up until today, biographers and scholars have speculated about the illnesses she lived with most or perhaps all of her life, some thinking it was chronic tuberculosis, others an illness of the thyroid, yet others have stressed the possibility of psychosomatic symptoms and mental illness. Usually, the posthumous diagnoses outlined earlier have been part of the narrative that illness kept her from leading the kind of life she wanted to live, traveling to foreign countries, climbing mountains, and completing all the unfinished projects in her desk drawer. Or that her illness was a result of the societal conditions of her time, and that the limited opportunities it offered to women somehow showed on a body level as well. One of her first biographers, Levin Schücking, a friend of hers, was even convinced that her recurring coughing of blood was not of organic origin, but linked to a nervous disorder. Remarkably, many of Droste's poems describe lonely excursions in the countryside, in which the speaker, in a form of literary cross-dressing, is referred to as male, thereby seemingly complying with the wilderness body ideal, but at the same time undermining it, as the speakers often share female attributes as well and or turn out to be not as able-bodied as expected, showing signs of illness such as coughing, headache, or fatigue. Rather than looking from the mountain top after a strenuous climb, the speakers in her poems are frequently found resting, lying in the grass, in the moss, or on the heath, or even inside the earth, as in her poem The Marl Pit. You can see an extract from it on the slide, which describes a fossil hunter exploring the geological strata of a pit and pondering on deep time and the end of humanity. As we will see in a moment in her poem In the Grass, there often is a clear sense of the speaker dissolving into the natural world around, with allusions to queer erotic encounters, as the writer Angela Steidele has shown, and a sense of blood relationship with plants and animals. Here, Droste's nature poetry comes surprisingly close to conceptions of the Anthropocene as by Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway.
Biographers and scholars haven't known how to approach Dorothy's illness either. Ernest de Selincourt in 1933 separates off her housebound years as posthumous life, life after death. Helen Derbyshire in 1958 points to a prolonged period of life in death before her actual death in 1855. This reflects how many people think about disability, of course, but it raises all the creativity and personhood of housebound disabled people. In 1978, Carl Ketchum writes Dorothy's illness in 1829 marks not the end of her life, but, quote, the end of Dorothy's active life as wanderer and sightseer. In some ways, this is true. After 1829, she undertook little travel, even locally, and after 1835 was limited to the house and gardens of Rydal Mount and dependent on others to help her access the garden. But in other ways, the years of her acute illness were some of the most imaginatively and creatively active of her life. The journals she keeps during these years, known as the Rydal Journals, are full of pain, fatigue and frustration, but also rich description and interest, of beauty, of shocking and surprising imagery, of joy in small things, the joy that keeps us going through pain. A bad night is followed by a warm, misty, muzzling, bird-chaunting morning. A glorious bed of anemones becomes her treasure all winter. In spring she records her strength much beaten, but also sees green things burst marvellously into light. This is the record she leaves us of her illness, the continuing, shocking persistence of growth. Though she cannot travel bodily, she travels in her mind, memory, and imagination. Poetry becomes a way of both reigniting memories and bringing the natural world into her mind and her room, even when she cannot leave her bed. A way of shifting location. And she writes more poetry in these years than any other time before, poems she groups together as sickbed consolations. In all these poems, she explores freedom beyond the body or through the body, writing, "No prisoner am I on this couch, my mind is free to roam." When she can't be outside in the 1830s, she brings the outside in, filling her room with plants, the beauties of my room, as she calls them. In the poems she writes during these years, these beauties of her room are transformed into keys that allow her to travel through memory and imagination. Her poetry repeats and performs an enfolding or unfolding of location, circling the idea of the mind as a mansion and memory as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies that William imagined for her in his poem on Tintern Abbey over 30 years earlier.
Indeed, illness is a strong presence in Droste's poetry as well, and it is often related to features of these texts that have been marked by critics as particularly innovative. From Droste's letters, we know that on days on which she was unable to cover distances through walking, she did so through visual aids. A lorgnette, a special kind of glasses comparable to opera glasses, and a telescope with which she often sat in front of the Rusch house looking for visitors. In a letter to a friend, she describes climbing her favorite mountain, the Sentis in the Alps, sitting on a bench and looking through her lorgnette. You can see the letter here on the slide. Imagined travels via these and other means occur in countless poems of hers, foregrounding the moldability of perception. These journeys often begin inside, on the sofa or in bed, and then carry on out into the distance through the power of the imagination. They express a striving for freedom, which goes way beyond physical constraints and which Droste often explicitly relates to the limited possibilities for women of her time, whether this be in the context of following a career, traveling great distances, or having political agency. Working on our project and seeing the connections to Dorothy, I realized that the dichotomy of writing/walking and its associations with being productive versus being ill and its associations with being unproductive, which Droste herself emphasized throughout her life in her letters, is thwarted by her writing itself, limiting her mobility on the bodily level. Illness becomes a vehicle for travel and freedom in the imagination on the level of writing.
Query Points was originally conceived of as a psychogeography walk for readers and listeners to complete themselves. We chose 5 texts from each writer to form part of our virtual wander, which each of us responded to, as well as responding to each other and our conversations. The concept was that the texts would correspond to different points in a walk, but that said walk would meet readers where they were, enabling them to tailor the length, speed, and route of the walk to suit their needs, bodies, and surroundings, whether this be a day-long hike, a trip to the corner shop, or even an imagined walk by someone unable to leave the house. But we moved away from this more literal interpretation of walking quite organically over the course of the project's creation for a number of reasons. Firstly, we realized that the most generative part of the project was the referential interplay between the texts themselves, which would be lost somewhat in the format of a psychogeography walk. But in addition, as Annika and Polly have just reflected on, one of the elements that we became fascinated by in both Droste's and Dorothy's writings was the importance for both writers of imaginative travel within the landscapes they occupied. And the project became an attempt to replicate that imaginative travel, in part through the inclusion of short prompts, like this one, and one-line instructions inspired by Dorothy's and Droste's texts. So this, for example, responds to Dorothy's poem, Floating Island. Beyond this, we hope that through the Choose Your Own Adventure format, which allows readers to finish the metaphorical walk at any point, query points might embody a kind of cryptpoetics, not merely exploring chronic illness as a theme, but also adaptable enough to be tailored to a reader's energy levels on any given day. The development of the project from a proposed psychogeography walk, however flexible, to a form of imaginative travel reflects the blurring of the distinction between walking and stillness, landscape and domesticity, adventuring and confinement, which is to be found in Dorothy's and Droste's texts. I would like to finish by talking you through one example Polly wrote, a response to Droste's Im Grase, or In the Grass.
And we start by reading Droste's In the Grass in the translation by Tayyiba Sulaiman and Gemma Craig Sharples. Sweetest peace, sweetest dreams in the grass, enswathed by the scent of the plants. Oh, the deep as deep, dizzying flood, as clouds melt in the azure's expanse. The sweetest of laughter fluttering down, a balm for the tired spinning head. And that soft voice drifts like white linden blooms, settling on the graves of the dead. When something in every cold bosom will stir, when the corpses will stretch and shift to breathe in the quiet, quiet breath of life, and their gently closed eyelids will lift, all of their treasures fall into ruin, dead love, dead desire, dead time, begin to awaken and gently resound like the peal of a trembling wind chime. O hours, more brief than the sunlight's kiss on the morning visage of the lake, more brief than the song of a bird in flight which drifts down from a high at daybreak, more brief than the gleam of a beetle's shell, shimmering as the sun starts to climb, more brief than the touch of a feverish hand, lingering for the last time. And yet, O heaven, grant me a prayer, just one, every time that the song of a bird flying forth in the blue rings out. Let a soul come fluttering along. Let every trembling, frail ray bear my colorful Hamlin's gleam. Let every warm hand feel my own, and every joy my dream.
So lovely to hear that read out. So in my internal network of poems, In the Grass is intertwined with other poems and songs about lying down in the grass or on the ground, particularly Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem Journey, with its opening line that could be one from Droste's poem, Ah, could I lay me down in this long grass, as well as Sylvia Plath's I Am Vertical, with its intimations of the longer rest of death. Plath's poem always makes me think of Dorothy lying down in a trench in John's Grove looking at the sky.
We then went to John's Grove, sate a while at first. Afterwards William lay, and I lay in the trench under the fence, he with his eyes shut and listening to the waterfalls and the birds. There was no one waterfall above another. It was the sound of waters in the air, the voice of the air. William heard me breathing and rustling now and then, but we both lay still and unseen by one another. He thought that it would be as sweet thus to lie so in the grave, to hear the peaceful sounds of the earth, and just to know that one's dear friends were near. The lake was still there. The lake was still. There was a boat out. Silver, how reflected, with delicate purple and yellowish hues, as I have seen spar lambs on the island, and running races together by the half dozen in the round field near us. The copses greenish, hawthorn green. Came home to dinner, then went to Mr. Simpson. We rested a long time under a wall. Sheep and lambs were in the field, cottages smoking. As I lay down on the grass, I observed the glittering silver line on the ridges of the backs of the sheep, owing to their situation respecting the sun, which made them look beautiful, but with something of strangeness, like animals of another kind, as if belonging to a more splendid world.
So I'd obviously noticed in the back of my mind, but not quite put together, the trench under the fence and the grass under the wall. Think about Imgrasa and Dorothy lying down in the grass made me link that trench episode in a new way to William's famous lines in his Intimations of Immortality ode on the loss of splendour in the grass. I read multiple translations into English of Imgrasa and was fascinated by different interpretations of the word turmel particularly, from fevers to frenzies to dreams. Angela Stedler has also flagged up the choice of the word turmeln as a moment of queer coding, with it being related to the idea of a crush. So that kind of feverish crush. I was also thinking of many conversations I have had recently about rest, joy, and survival. When is rest necessary and joyful? When is it a kind of death? This is my response. So this is what I wrote for the piece. As I lay down on the grass, I observed. After Sylvia Plath, after Edna St. Vincent Millay, after Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, after Dorothy Wordsworth, after a nun. All year I have been longing to lay myself down in long grass in the sun casting its green shadows over my toasting skin. So bee-flies and butterflies doze on my sticky limbs, and dragonflies skim my eyelashes, and I am a plant amongst plants. The grass is long and full of life. The grass is long and full of death. Ticks, weeds, human suffering, the mower trapped in the shed by the scaffolding. All the dazed year I have failed, reelingly vertical, frenzied with the whirl of the world, groggy with transience translated in my blood into woozy longing for the rapture you wrote of. The daring halt, euphoric, fevered. I want spine to ground, each cell down-reaching, my bones dissolving into moss and dandelions, self-heal and celandine, between the tall dry stone wall and the little apple tree, hidden from human uprightness. The greatest surface of our body touching the body of the earth, touching the voice of the air, the voice of the water in the air, the voice of the trees in the earth, the voice of the grass, the voice of the grass, the voice of the first yellow leaves falling. Oh friends, birds, so near unseen, all the dead in my chest, all the dead, let me, I beg, be bold enough to keep my heart wakeful. I will not close my eyes for peace. I will not close my eyes for peace. There are other ways to be useful. And yet, I fain would lie in this grass, sweet dizzy, sweet care, sweet kiss of hot, dry dust. I would roll in it, follow the beam of its light. I am tired, so tired. It is hard, after all, to talk of rest from travel, weary, and not mean end of lying down, and not mean finally of green grass without growing over me, of turf without grave, of dig without buried, of trench without corpse, of dirt without death, sweet growth, sweet growing, sweet deep flood, sweet tired swimming head. I will lay you down and open you up to the sky you love, and when we have talked it all through with the stars, radiance of migrating space rubble marking of different path, I will raise you back up and float you onward, float on into splendor. That shimmering line half glimpsed through the woods is not the border between this and the next, but the lake, deep enough to hold all our tears and not spill over, clear and steady enough to show you yourself above and beneath the mirror, a rock amongst rocks, a tree amongst trees. Yes, lie down. You prefer it that way, more natural. Lie down and then swim on.
Thank you, Polly. I love that piece so much. And yeah, lying down, it's great. Polly's example here demonstrates that it isn't just Dorothy's and Droste's writing that flowed into the creation of new texts as part of query points, but also numerous other writers and translators, as well as moments from the conversations held between the three of us. And as we mentioned, a number of the pieces in query points are followed by a one-line prompt, encouraging the reader too to get involved in this creative conversation. If you play the game after In the Grass, you get the prompt, lie down, stretch up, out, look up, hallucinate. And we'd love for you to try this after the talk. We very much experienced the creation of query points as practices research. And one of the unexpected things that very much came to the fore as we reflected on this experience was that of creative collaboration. This particularly struck me when I was proofreading both language versions and I realized I could no longer remember who had originally written which text or in what language. The conversations and the associations between all the pieces of writing built on and responded to each other. This focus on collaboration felt particularly significant in a project honouring Dorothy, whose understanding of herself as part of and contributing to a collaborative creative endeavour can be found in her writings, and very much calls into question tendencies to commemorate the Romantics as individual geniuses. This sense of collaboration is also integral to any queer or crip poetics, which call on us to recognise the importance of interdependence in life as in writing. Our project seeks to open up these aspects of Dorothy's and Droste's lives and poetics to the public in different ways, playful, querying, encouraging everyone to ask more and assume less, even if, like Dorothy's queries in her Alfoxden journals, we can't get a clear answer. So thanks so much for listening, and I'm delighted to pass on to Abby.
Thank you very much. It's just wonderful to hear those poems read out loud, isn't it? It's just fantastic. So I'm going to be talking slightly separately from the Career Points project, but a lot of my research that I've been doing overlaps with themes that have come out of that project. So some nice, interesting overlaps. So my PhD looks at space, place, and queer identity in the writing of Anne Lister. Before beginning my PhD, I studied for a Master's in Literature at the University of Cumbria, and it was during that Master's that my fascination with Dorothy Wordsworth began. After my MA, I was very fortunate to be employed at Wordsworth Grasmere, home to Dove Cottage, the Jerwood Centre, and the Wordsworth Museum. And it's here that my interest in Dorothy Wordsworth really expanded further, and talking to visitors about her life and writing was my favourite part about working there. I'm now entering the second part of my PhD, the second year, and my thesis looks at Anne Lister's identity and how it affects her navigation through different spaces and places. I'm sure some of you already know of Anne Lister, but I'll try and give a brief overview. I feel like I could talk for 15 minutes just about who she was. She was so multifaceted. So she lived from 1791 to 1840. She was born in Market Wheaton and moved to Halifax in Yorkshire in 1815 to live with her aunt and uncle in Shibden Hall. After her uncle's death in 1826, she began to manage the estate and eventually inherited it in 1836. So she was a businesswoman, landowner, traveller, scholar, and most commonly probably known as a diarist. Her diaries amount to over 5 million words, and within these diaries, approximately a sixth of them are written in her own cipher, a code that she called her crypt hand. It is within these crypt hand sections that we hear the most detail of her encounters as a lesbian, amongst other private happenings that she wished to keep to herself. As you can see on the slide, Lister's crypt hand is broad. It's made up from Greek and Latin, mathematical symbols, punctuation. This is the cipher of an educated person, and the act of keeping a code in this way definitely came from a place of privilege. The privilege of being able to keep her journal private in this way is also important. Lister was very particular about who saw her journal, and she also had the extra layer of safety when writing in crypt hand. This level of secrecy is different from Dorothy Wordsworth's journal. Dorothy writes in her Grasmere journal that she resolved to keep a journal because I will not quarrel with myself, and because I shall give William pleasure by it when he comes home again. So there's more transparency with Dorothy's journal. There's an expectation that others might read it and share in the experiences that Dorothy's been through. I'd like the focus of the next few minutes to be on the benefits of comparing two writers. Originally, I had planned on researching both Anne Lister and Dorothy Wordsworth for my PhD, but quickly realised with those 5 million words that I probably wouldn't do either of them enough justice, so I stuck just with Anne Lister. However, since the publication of Dorothy Wordsworth's Rydal journals, edited by Nicholas Mason and Suzanne Sutton, I now have access to Dorothy's later diary entries. This encouraged me, not that I needed much encouragement, to compare Lister and Wordsworth anyway, despite the material not being the key focus of my thesis. And I had an interesting conversation with a university colleague of mine, Kira Welland, who I think is watching this talk, about the act of kind of falling down rabbit holes in your first year of your PhD. And we kind of were beating ourselves up about it for a while. And then we sort of realised that I think it's a really important part of doing a PhD is that you fall down these avenues, and often it's the things that come from that that influence your thesis. So what came from this was a very beneficial piece of work, kind of looking at Anne Lister and Dorothy Wordsworth's overlaps. I was able to look at Dorothy's diary entries and letters from her visits to Halifax in 1827 and 1829, and these helped me understand Halifax society in Lister's life in more depth, and it did work both ways. So my prior knowledge of Halifax through Lister's writing enabled me to visualise much more effectively the places that Dorothy visited in Halifax. I found out that their social connections in Halifax overlapped greatly. This is pointed out in the footnotes of Dorothy's Rydal journals too, which state that so similar were their circles, in fact, that the diarists almost certainly would have met had Lister not been away on the continent during both of Dorothy's final 2 visits to Halifax. If you want to hear me waffle on about that and get annoyed that they never met, I did do a talk for the Anne Lister Research Summit, which I'll link at the end if anyone would like to sort of hear a bit more about that, but that's also on YouTube. I unfortunately don't have time to complain that they never met. So at first I did think that my divergence into exploring Halifax through Dorothy's eyes was really separate from my thesis, and I worried about how I was using my time and if it was worth me continuing to consider Dorothy's writing in this way. This comparison of Lister and Wordsworth, this consideration of them both in the same spaces, completely aided my understanding of them both. Without considering the social connections between the 2 writers, I wouldn't have fallen down the rabbit hole of researching Dorothy's guardian in Halifax, Miss Elizabeth Rawson, who was Miss Elizabeth Threlkeld before marriage. I wouldn't have come to understand the Rawson family of Halifax on such a deep level, and my research into the Rawsons has been vital for my understanding of Lister's Halifax. The Rawson family were very dominant in Halifax and very wealthy, and they were a family that Lister had strong feelings for, either positive or most often quite negative. I think she saw them as rivals somehow. But then there's also the question of other similarities between Wordsworth and Lister, some of which have already been mentioned as part of the Query Points project. I'm now going to explore a couple of these similarities further in sort of a taster format. So there's much more to be said about these, but this is just a brief overview. So firstly, we have queerness. We have already heard about research into Dorothy through a queer lens. Comparing her queer identity with Lister's could be an interesting study. I use the word queer for Lister as it covers both her sexuality and her gender identity. Lister writes in her journal in 1821, "I love and only love the fairer sex." So unlike in Dorothy and Droste's writing, Lister explicitly tells her journal that she is only romantically attracted to women. We have that clarity. Her gender, however, remains a little more ambiguous. Some scholars, such as Dr. Kit Hayham, have used they-them pronouns to refer to Lister, as they feel they better explain her relationship with her gender. I'm researching her gender identity at the moment, and I can completely see why they-them pronouns feel appropriate. Some researchers are against this, however, as I think this overlaps with the inability to define or diagnose people after their death. As we saw earlier in the Query Points project, it's hard to know what to do in that situation. I think you can explore it, but you can't necessarily give a direct answer. But in Lister's case, there is strong evidence that she at times wasn't fully comfortable under the label woman, and seemingly not man either. So it's an interesting research path to be on. I think using she, her, and they, them pronouns interchangeably works well, and this has been used on some occasions. but ongoing research into Lister's gender identity can only help us understand more about her navigation through the world. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the next comparison we can make between Lister and Dorothy is chronic illness. Anne Lister contracted an STI from her partner Mariana in 1821, which became chronic. She referred to it in her journals as a venereal complaint, and she didn't get a confirmed diagnosis during her lifetime, but lack of antibiotics or effective treatment at the time meant that she continued to have what she called a venereal taint for the rest of her life. She developed a symbol for it in her diary and would add extra detail depending on the severity of symptoms, which seemed to be at their worst in the 1820s after first contracting the infection. The symbol that she created was also edited over time. So on the left of the slide, the image at the top is actually the symbol that she would use to describe her menstruation. So she would do 2 dots horizontally. I think she did 2 vertical dots for her later partner Anne Walker's menstruation, and it just helped her keep track of those. But the symbol at the bottom, the E and the 2 dots, is the one that she would use for marking down when she had symptoms of her venereal complaint. On March the 9th in 1822, Lister explained her notation system, and these images and text here are taken from the Factor with Potential website. So from this time, the number of dots under E shall signify how often the lotion has been used during the day. Thus, 1 dot once, 2 dots twice, 3 dots 3 times, etc. A couple of months later, she writes, "This mark O shall henceforth signify no discharge. 1 dot within it shall signify a little, 2 middling, 3 much, etc." So in that second image, you can see the circle with the 2 dots in the middle as well. And then about 3 years later, Lister refined her system to reflect the use of a specific instrument. The dots under the E now signify the number of times a day I've used the syringe. So you can see she kind of develops this over time to suit her needs and her records in her journal. On the 27th of August, 1823, as she's trying to figure out the cause of her illness and try and really find a diagnosis, she writes this. "During dinner, told my aunt about my complaint, that I thought it venereal. She guessed I had got it at the Duffins, then at Croft. This I denied, but did not say how or where I got it, though I said I knew very well. My aunt took it all quite well. Luckily thinks the complaint very easily taken by going to the necessary, drinking out of the same glass, etc. And it is lucky enough she does think so." So her aunt believes that Lister contracted the disease in a non-sexual manner, so sharing a drinking glass with somebody who had the infection or the same toilet. But the act of developing a particular mark in her diary for this condition shows her need to record symptoms and keep track of her illness. As it's also in its own form of code, there's no requirement that if anybody found her journal that they would know what she was referring to. So it's again that level of secrecy. Like Dorothy and Droste, Lister's symptoms caused her to alter her behaviours. This was particularly prevalent just after contracting the illness, when she had to walk to Halifax slowly and with inconvenience. She would also complain that it would take her an hour to dress and apply her lotion treatment. And as somebody who was very keen on being fast and efficient, this really did upset Lister. She remarks a few times, it took me an hour to get ready, and this is not something that she enjoys. The first few weeks of symptoms created anxiety within Lister, and as an avid walker, there must have been worry about how this could affect her long term. It was so interesting to hear about how the Query Points project looked at Wordsworth and Droste's chronic conditions, and I think it would be interesting to see how the adaptations they had to make in their lives compared to Lister's. So, in comparing these 2 writers, I've gained an understanding that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I've also learned that falling down an unexpected rabbit hole, thank you, Kira, of research is a positive thing. I will pop the link to the chat of me complaining that they never met. I'll pop it in the chat, but also there's a really good resource on the Pact with Potential website about Anne Lister's journey to finding or trying to find a diagnosis. So I'll also put that in the chat as well, but these can be found on the Pact with Potential website. And I also promise that I do have an email. It's kind of blurred into this same image, but just in case, it's abby.palmer@uni.cumbria.ac.uk if anyone has any questions. I'd love to ask a question back to the Query Points project now. As I've already spoken about throughout this conversation, the act of comparing two writers can be incredibly beneficial to understanding kind of different things about them that you might not come across otherwise. I'd love to hear a bit about how you found the act of comparing two writers creatively and how that's different from comparing them like I am in more of an academic sort of scholarly way. I'd love to hear about kind of what's one key takeaway that you had from doing things this way that you might not have otherwise got if you weren't doing it creatively. So I will throw that out there.
Thank you so much, Abby. Who wants to take that away? And Annika, do you want to think
I
about
mean,
it?
the first thing that came to mind, embarrassingly, was me and Polly being like, we should write fanfic about Dorothy and Droste. Which is very much not.
Yeah, and we did, right?
Well,
Yeah.
yes, but we were like, we could make it a novel. Could we pitch that? Yeah.
I think it opens all sorts of possibilities. I think when you open creative responses in a way that there's that frustration, right? That everybody has when they're looking at Dorothy Wordsworth and Anne Lister, that they should meet, and they just somehow don't. And they have so many shared people in common, so much shared circle. How is it that they didn't meet? What you can do creatively, obviously, is think, well, what would happen if they did meet? And in some ways, that was the whole kind of premise of what we were doing, was to think, because part of what we have, there's a series of kind of correspondences between Droste and Dorothy that obviously didn't and couldn't happen, that we have, that it allows you to throw up these ideas and ask what if questions that you can't do in academic work in quite the same way. Anyway, you can't answer them, I suppose. You can ask them, but you can't answer them, whereas we were allowed to play with those questions a little bit further. Do you want to add anything? I'm looking at the other two of you as though you can see me looking at you.
No, you put it down really well. I'm fascinated by the freedom the creative approach actually offered to us. And I also found it interesting to see how, well, if you would like to think of something like a missed energy that comes from two interesting people not meeting, when you write your own creative text, you can somehow imagine that this energy comes to life in this new text. So that seemed something that inspired me.
I think that the exciting thing about being able to approach it from a creative thing is you don't feel bad about those rabbit holes. It's like they're important whether you're approaching something creatively or academically, but I think you give yourself a little bit more license to go down them. And I think you're right. You know, your conversation with your colleague, like, those are sort of where the magic happens, and those are the things that take us so much further. And definitely, I mean, like, as we reflected in the talk, the project we finished with wasn't quite the project that we pitched to a funding body 18 months earlier. And that's such a wonderful thing, actually, that it was dynamic and it became its own thing.
And I think continues to have roots as well, because I was thinking about the fact that I've had that in some ways happen the other way around as well, that recovering Dorothy in some ways, my book about Dorothy's illness really started as creative work that was frustrated by not being able to do that work academically, right? So I wanted, with a colleague, Emily Stanback, who works on romantic disability studies, and is based at the University of Southern Mississippi. We wanted for a long time to do something to transcribe the Rydell journals, basically. And we weren't able to do that for various logistical reasons, which is probably a good thing, because the version that now exists is brilliant. And I don't think we would have been able to we didn't have the resources to spend the time and have the research students and everything to do the amazing detailed notes that Nick and Suzanne created with the Rydell journals, which are this extraordinary, like, the journals themselves are quite slim, and the book is, I have it next to me, like it's bigger than the Bible. Like you could kill someone with it if it fell on them. It's a huge text for what are quite slim things. And they were able to spend all this time on it that we just couldn't have done. But when I was frustrated about not being able to do that, I ended up writing some poems, drawing from transcriptions, because I realized I could do that without treading on anybody's toes academically. And it was from doing that that then the seed of Recovering Dorothy grew, thinking, oh, I could actually write a biography about this rather than which became a research book. So that relationship between the creative project, the research project, the academic work can be a whole kind of big mishmash, I think, really a kind of more of a web than a kind of linear path in some ways.
And if I may add that, I found it very helpful to have this creative freedom to do something like a travel in time. And really to get into Dorothy's or Droste's body and mind and try to imagine how it was like to be them. Of course, this is something you cannot do as an academic, but I would say that it actually helps understanding historical contexts, also particular choices in writing, which would then again help your academic work. Actually, I think combining several approaches is always the most helpful thing you can do. That's my conclusion.
That makes
You've
a lot.
convinced me. I'll write some fan fiction now on Dorothy and Anne. But no, it's true. I think combining different elements is really important and can bring out, like you say, avenues you might not expect.
A chance meeting in the Lake District. Anything could happen. If anybody has any questions for us, do share them. You can pop them in the chat, pop them in the Q&A box. Do ask away. Nothing too small or too great, too serious or too unserious in some ways. Abby, where do you think you're linking Dorothy and Lister together? Can you see where that's going yet? Is there a kind of direction that that's taking you in?
I'm not sure. Just the act of comparing them both helped my understanding of Halifax as a space. But I think I've done quite a lot now that it needs to go somewhere. So I'm wondering about it being an article separate from the thesis or whether to try and incorporate it in. But I think I'd like to put that research somewhere because it turned out that I learned a lot more than I thought I would. And I think interesting connections that hopefully then others could build on. I'm just not sure the format that's going to take yet. The kind of thing I would lean towards is an article, but then something more creative is not really tempting to kind of get imagination flowing. In this project, I mean, you can never predict how at the beginning how it will end. But the way that you kind of learn as you went, I think, is a really valuable thing. And I like that about creativity is that you can kind of start at a point and then with more input end at a different one. And so I wouldn't want it to be something that I write and then it just doesn't get read. I'd like it to be something that people can engage with. So I'm wondering about doing something in Halifax and seeing how that would go, but I just haven't figured it out exactly yet. Any suggestions welcome. But yeah, it's one that I'd like people to get involved with.
I love the idea of that, like doing something in place, because that the idea of those kind of networks and those relationships between all those people who crossed over and who knew each other and who were so like almost connected in some ways or literally connected as well.
Yeah.
So intriguing.
There's a lot of what could have been there, but there's also a lot of what did happen that even though they didn't quite meet, there's so much overlap that I think it could go down a few different routes as well.
I was also really intrigued as well in that kind of journaling thing about thinking about how you write down symptoms, because one of the things I'm really aware of with Dorothy, whenever we talk about her and her health, is that we don't know anything about her menstrual cycle. We don't know anything about her menstrual health at all, and how that might have tied into thinking about that point where she becomes really ill is in her 50s as well, and she has a period where she's like quite a lot better around what may have been menopause as well. And you wonder how much some of her symptoms may be hormonally linked too, but we don't, as far as I know, we don't have any record of it. And what Nick and Suzanne realized when they were looking at the Rydell journals is that she does have a way of noting down when she's taking laudanum for her pain. But is there actually something as simple as like dots or something that she's doing that no one else has noticed to actually mark down? So I'm going to look back at that now and have a think think about it.
I
Really
think
interesting.
that's such
weren't
an.
there?
Oh,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry.
Annika, you
No,
go.
okay. I was wondering that there were also these verbal codes, right? For especially referring to menstruation. I I was thinking that feeling unwell could also sometimes mean that you were menstruating, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Sorry, just a side note.
yeah.
Now, Annie, what was it you were going to say?
Oh no, I just I think the point you made, Abby, was really interesting. That sorry, I'm just noticed there's a question in the Q&A. So I'll make this brief. But the difference between a journal written for external consumption, effectively, like for sharing with family, for sharing with William, and this diary that is very clearly very private because it's literally written in code. Um, and yeah, so obviously what you're sharing there is going to be very different, or potentially there are those codes for laudanum and things, but she's not noting to herself what they mean so that nobody else necessarily picks up on that. Um,
Yeah,
which
they're very
yeah.
differently constructed. With Anne, there is the tendency to go, well, she puts absolutely everything in her journal because it's so detailed and so meticulous. But of course, there will be the odd thing that doesn't make it in there. And so with Dorothy, you kind of go, well, there's gaps and we know there's gaps. And how can we interpret these gaps and kind of imagine what happened? I think on the other side with Anne, we go too far into thinking that everything is on the page. And it's so easy to assume that because it's so meticulously done. But there's got to be things that aren't there. And there's got to be things that she maybe doesn't find even the time to write down. But she does write that she can tell her journal what she can tell no one else, if I'm quoting that correctly. So she really does put everything into it that she can. But there's times that she's traveling and she'll do travel notes and then put them into the journal later. And so you don't know what gets missed and you don't know what is missing in those moments. But yeah, interesting the different approaches definitely to kind of constructing their diaries.
Interesting. Matthew's put a comment in the Q&A saying, could you say a bit more about what we learned from valuing ongoing processes rather than focusing too much on results? I really liked Polly's genealogy for her poem as part of a long chain, and Abby's point on productive rabbit holes seems particularly relevant with these documents of ongoing lives. I mean, I think like I definitely felt for query points, one of the most exciting things was the process, and I was very lucky because I already knew Annika and already knew Polly and got to put them in touch with each other. And it was also really lovely seeing that like professional and personal relationship grow between you guys and seeing your work influencing each other. And so much of that can't really go in a funding report. You know, it's like, okay, we created this project and I'm really proud of it. But so much of what we talked about, I mean, we had so many more texts than the 25 that went in there. And yeah, I think it can be really hard in a sort of a landscape where you're focusing on output to be able to say, okay, well, there was a lot that's ephemeral, and that was about our own learning process, and that's great. Polly, you looked like you were about to.
Yeah, I was just agreeing completely with that. That the process was extraordinary. So we met once a month. So that's just about right. On online, and all of the conversations that we had, I think, are going to be have changed what I'm working on in the future as well. They're just feeding through into all sorts of things. Like any creative collaboration that we have. But for me, it was particularly useful in thinking about what working collaboratively is and can be, and what can be produced out of it, and how, like, every time I talk about this project, it's so joyful, and it's such a wonderful thing to talk about, because it's not just mine. It's not, it's this shared thing that we created together with all these other people as well, who are absent, and some of them we only know through texts, and all those chains of associations that we each individually have as well, and those all kind of come together and form something new. And as Annie said, that is kind of something that is somewhat unrecordable by a funding body, but also made me think really differently about romantic era collaborations as well, and what they were doing and what the relationships between all these creative people were.
Yeah, it's also not that recordable in literary history and documents, right? Sometimes we have traces where we can actually see how the collaboration works, with some person editing another person's text and so on. And then we have letters. And for me, the experience on working on this project really, yeah, made me understand, as you said, literary collaboration a lot more, because it's also a big topic with Annette von Droste-Hülshoff, who had, I mean, I mentioned all these women writers or intellectuals with whom she was writing letters and sharing ideas and working on drafts and rejecting drafts and so on. And there was also her male friend, Levin Schücking, with whom she had this interesting poetry contest. So he said, well, you always write so slowly, you will never be able to write a poem a day. And then she said, well, I'm going to do it. And she did it. And it was her most famous and also greatest poetry collection in the end. And I realized how important this collaboration is for all creativity, and that this whole idea of thinking we have these particular names that, I don't know, are symbols of a literary period or of literary genius. It's probably never been that way. Probably there were always many people involved, and sometimes their names are on the book cover. I mean, translation is another super important topic which we dealt with in our project all the time. And many people don't think about how important translations are, both for writers. I mean, in the past, many, especially women writers, were also translators. And they would always, I don't know, the translation of other texts would always be part of their own writing, or very often. And it's a very creative process, which I probably, I guess all of you are familiar with. But nonetheless, it's a topic that people tend to forget. And that was fascinating to experience the importance of all this. But I think we have another question. I didn't want to say so much to that question.
Yeah, so the other question was in the chat, and it's how much responsibility and freedom do you feel when using these sources creatively? I can't speak much on creatively because I'm yet to do that with this work. But I do feel a great responsibility just even reading Lister's diary. I think it's such a special thing to be able to do, and you can never lose that feeling that this is a private thing that actually was never intended necessarily to be read by anybody else. And so I feel a great responsibility of getting things right. Amazing transcribers, just before I started my PhD, transcribed all of the journal, and I'm sure they felt the same in that process, that you have to make sure it's almost like translation when you think about the code as well, not quite the same, but that thing of wanting to get it completely right. And in her coded sections, there's no gaps, no punctuation, it is just code. And so just finding where the gaps would be, where maybe breaks in the sentence would be, it's really difficult. But they did that brilliant task. So thankfully, I didn't have to do as much of that. But just at the beginning of beginning this research, I sort of felt guilty sometimes, just to kind of thinking of the ethics of, should I be reading this person's most deep secrets. And I think what comes with that is a great respect for the writing. And as long as you keep that and know that you can't interpret it too far, like we've spoken about before, we can't put too much of our own stamp on it. We have to respect what's there. Um, that's kind of how I had to come into researching her diaries. But I'd love to hear about it from like the creative side. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I mean, Polly, I feel you had really interesting thoughts on this, definitely around Dorothy and how we use her words.
Yeah, I mean, I've was very similarly like I think there is a great ethical responsibility whenever you're dealing with anyone who's a real person, right? To respect their personhood. And I think sometimes we forget that in scholarship as much as we forget it in creative things. And um, there's been lots of novels and poetry written about Dorothy and about William and about their circle and their lives, um, some of which is more or less fantastical in some ways. Um, I think when it goes to the playful end of things, in some ways it's less painful than when it tries to be serious sometimes. But there's also really interesting things that happen with people trying. I have a whole um, bit of research from back when I was working academically on this about people lineating Dorothy's journal and turning it into poetry, which is like something that I'm really fascinated by why people would choose to do that. Like if she wanted to write it as poems, she would do. But then I myself then used the Rydell journals when they weren't published as a found text in a kind of response to that history in some ways. So maybe I became the problem in some ways there. Um, but I think when you're talking about these kind of what if questions, even those what if questions have to be grounded in something that's plausible in the text to me. And I know there are some books written about the Wordsworth's lives that I find so annoying because they get really basic things wrong. Um, or like give people the wrong pet names and things like that. And it's like, well, if you're gonna like, there's so much that's actually there. Like, use what's there and then run with the gaps. Don't like, yeah, um, yeah. I will not have that rant now.
I think for our project, we try to be to refer to sources whenever possible. We try to do a lot of research and be really concise as possible. And I think what was also important was to kind of make visible very, yeah, very clearly where something was invented and where we were close to the sources. We also, on the website, there are also there's a long list of sources for our research, which is quite important, I think. And I think that is a good model generally if you want to approach a historical topic creatively, that you will be prepared to show your sources.
Mm. Maybe that's a useful point because I realize we're almost at half past. That might be a useful point to end. A last point to kind of be responsible, be conscientious, be ethical, and show your sources. But also play with it. Be willing to play with it, but it's ethical play. Thank you all so much. Thank you everyone for coming, everybody for listening. This has been so wonderful, and I hope more conversations can come out of this as we go on.